So now that I have an audio file created, I can drag it into Reaper and I can adjust Reaper to match the tempo of this audio file. So I'm going to drag this into Reaper. It's going to make a track. And you'll notice the first thing is that this track is not lined up with the grid lines, and there's no kind of relationship between them. Because my tempo, the default tempo of a Reaper track is 120, and that wasn't the tempo that I saved this at. And you should, experiment with what tempo you want your sequencer to play at. Don't always sort of stick with the default. So in this instance, what I need to do, first off, and something he clarifies in the video, is you need to make sure that you allow yourself to change the beat structure, like where the beats are, without moving the sound file, right? So right now, if I change the beat structure of this sound file will move, so it stays starting at the same beat that it started at, which right now is beat 4. So this track will sort of move as I change the tempo. So instead of that behavior, I want it to stay synced to time. So I'm going to go to Item Properties, Item Time Base. I'm going to set it to time rather than beats. So I click Apply and OK. All right. So now when I change the tempo, so that where the beats are located, this is going to stay synced to time, which is this bottom part. So notice if right now, beat 2 is starting at 2 seconds. So if I change this tempo to 98, for example, beat 2 now is starting at a different time, but this didn't move because this is synced to start where this time is located. So I go back to 120. Notice that the audio file doesn't move, just the time base does. All right, so that's good enough. Now I need to trim this and find the beginning of this first beat. Notice right now we're snapping, so I need to turn snap mode off so I can drag continuously. And then I'm going to put my cursor here and zoom in. Now the trick here is you have to find a reference point in this sound. So in my sample, and probably in your samples as well, the point at which it repeats, you're probably going to have the same sound, right? So this is just one sound repeated over and over again. You probably have something similar in your sequence where at some point you have the same sound happen. So what we're looking for is a reference point in this sound that I can use and find again when I'm looking to find where the next beat or next bar starts. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And I'm going to look for something, and in this instance, what I'm going to be looking for is where the waveform first makes its first big change. So right here, it looks like the first big change that happens is this kind of downturn right here. So I'm going to zoom into that, and I'm going to select right where it crosses the 0 axis, and I'm going to call this the beginning of this sample. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say split items at cursor. So now I've got 2 items. I'm going to delete this one, and this one I'm going to move to beat 1. Okay, so now if I zoom out, go back to beat 1, I can see that the very first thing that happens in my song, or in this track, is this downturn in the audio waveform. So there's my first beat. Now I know that this is just, the same thing being repeated over and over again at a regular tempo. So I can just count beats. This is beat 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be the beginning of the second bar, so the first beat of the second bar. So I'm going to look in here, and I'm going to be looking for that same reference point in the waveform. So go to in here, zoom in a little bit, and what I'm looking for again is that first downturn. Go ahead and zoom in, drag this over to where the first 0 crossing is, zoom in a little bit more, and really get super precise with it. Okay, that's pretty good. So there's a sample, right? So I'm lining the cursor up right with that sample. All right, so I'm going to zoom out now. But to help remember this point, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to split the sound file. So if you remember, if I right-click, the hotkey is S. So I'm just going to type S. I'm going to make 2 sound files. This is one, and this is the other, and this is right where that beat starts. All right, so I know I want this to be the downbeat of bar 2. But the downbeat of bar 2 right now is right here. So just like it shows in the video, I'm going to jump to the beginning of bar 2. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to insert tempo time signature marker. Just click OK. There it is. And now what I want to do is I want to move this tempo time signature marker to this edit. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and I'm going to command, because I'm on a Mac, command click. Notice the tempo is going to change. You'll see the tempo change down here as I drag this. Whoops, so actually you won't see a tempo change right there because our cursor is a different place. So right now, if I move my cursor over here, I can see the tempo change as I drag it, right? So I'm going to drag it right to that edit. I'm going to zoom in and just get as close as I possibly can. So not quite there yet. Zoom in a little bit more. That's pretty damn close. There we go. All right, and a little bit closer. The more precise you can get, the more you will have accurate more accurate your tempo will be. If you're not accurate here, what you'll find is that the later beats in your sequence will start to drift from where the tempo of the DAW is. So if I had gotten that incorrect here, it would have been a problem. So now I have two audio waveforms. One, you can see is synced really neatly up to the beat. We can see here's the tempo, 99.864. And over here, we can see the tempo switches to 120 because of that marker that I put in. And now this is still off, right? This is still out of time. So what I need to do is I need to get rid of this marker so the tempo does not change. And now the tempo is 99.864 for the whole track, and you can see everything lines up really neatly. Once I've done that, I can delete this, zoom in over there, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put back on snap mode again. Now, right now, my sound starts right at the first beat, but I don't really want that. I actually want a little bit of time where the sound floor is kind of silenced before that first beat starts. And the reason why I might do that is because I'm going to record tracks on top of it, so I want the ability to be able to record a track a little bit earlier than this first beat. If, for example, I want to have some kind of a pickup or some kind of a lead-in, or I just want to be able to have some leeway, so if I do make a sound, I'm not going to cut it off artificially by having this all the way at the beginning. So I'm giving myself some leeway. Notice that everything's still lined up to the beat, but I have a blank bar in front. I'm going to throw on the metronome, go back to the beginning of the track, and let's listen to this and see if it sounds like it's in time. Not too bad, right? Notice the metronome's kind of quiet. If we double click here or right click, we can get the metronome settings, we can turn that volume up so we can hear it a little bit better. But of course, you still likely won't hear it right at the same time because this is going to be so loud. But I'm going to zoom into this a little bit and think to myself, is this really where that first beat happens? Maybe the beat is actually sort of like this part or like that sharp part. So I'm going to turn off snap mode again, and I'm going to maneuver this a little bit so the beat happens right where that first click is. Let's go back to the beginning and listen to that. So this is kind of a subtle distinction about whether where the beat actually starts in this kind of a track. And let's take a look at some of the rest of this track to sort of see how this might play out. So in my original recording, it was actually a longer recording. I was just re-triggering. And once I stopped re-triggering it, I got the full audio file. And notice there's two other events that happen over here that are out of time. So I want to sync these up so that these are both going to be on the beat. So let's go ahead and zoom in. I'm going to turn off snap mode because I want to be able to sort of flexibly edit this. So there's my second sort of event I want to put on the beat. I'm going to move this up to kind of where this note starts. So maybe not there, but maybe like right there. Zoom in maybe a little bit, make sure I get it right in the right place. I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to press S to split these tracks. Now I'm going to go to the next sound event, which is over here. All right. So now I'm going to zoom in. What I'm looking for is where this sound starts, like this whole thing kind of starts with this little bit right there. So I'm going to drag that to where that is. Zoom in, again over there. Now I'm going to split the sound file. Okay. So now I have this guy on his own sound file, this guy on his own sound file. Now what I want to do is I want to drag this to a beat. So I'm going to drag this so this is actually on beat 5. Put snap mode back on. I'm going to get rid of this, pull it back to beat 5. Now when I drag this, it's going to snap it onto the grid. So now this is located right at beat 5, right on the grid. Same thing, I'm going to pull this back, and I want this to be on beat 6. So I'm going to move this forward, and now this is snapped to beat 6. Let's listen to that. So I'm going to jump to beat 4, and players, we can hear the click track. On bar 5, we'll hear this. On bar 6, we'll hear that. Cool. But to be honest, I think that this sound file doesn't start here, right? Kind of where I think it might start is this big response. All this stuff is kind of like leading up to this event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off snap mode. I'm going to kind of drag this over to make some space. I'm going to drag this over so that that lines right up with beat 6. And I can pull this back, and then maybe I'll do a little crossfade like that. So now the sound file doesn't start right there, but the sound itself starts there. So we have the sort of preliminary element and then sort of where the beat happens. Let's listen to that and see if that sounds any good. To my ears, that sounds better. I like that. So that's the kind of thing you might have to keep track of, is when you're listening to a sound, where the actual beat of that sound located. It may not be at the beginning of the waveform, or maybe like a peak inside the waveform. So think about that as you're editing. So now I have my backing track imported. I have it synced up to the beat. All of the different elements are synced up to be appropriate, and I'm ready to record some audio on top of it. So we've been using a click track to listen to whether or not this is all synced up. But you can also use a click track to sync up another recording and sort of give yourself a tempo reference as you're recording on top of this. So I'm going to make a new track. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller since we don't need to see so much detail. Now this track I'm going to record some audio in. So I'm going to record, enable it. There's my incoming audio. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of the track. I've got my metronome on, so I know I'm going to hear the metronome, and I'm going to get a little 4-beat count in before the song starts. So I'm going to hit record. All right. So I'm going to save my sound file. Uh-oh, big problem, clipping. So what's happened is my audio input, the amplifier, the volume of the audio input on my computer is too loud, so it's clipping and it's making distortion. You can see this waveform's reaching all the way to the top, and that's not what we want. If we zoom in, let's zoom in right here. Let's see what that looks like. So you'll notice that most of these waveforms, the waveform is nice sort of round curves when we get to the peaks. But here, look at how these waveforms are clipped off and really square looking. So that's what happens if you have your input gain too much, and that's going to cause distortion. Now for something like this, which is a hand clap, you might not notice it so much because the hand clap is already sort of very noisy. It's a very noisy component to that impulse. But really, this is not the right thing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that recording, and I'm going to go into my computer settings, and I'm going to turn down the input volume. So that's going to let me record audio without it clipping. Go back to Reaper, I'll clear my overload meter, go back to beat 1, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see, and I'm going to record again. This time I'm going to record a pickup, so I can record something before my main reference track happens, because I'm listening to the click. Uh-oh, still clipping, right? So that's okay. I'm using clapping my hands in front of my computer mic, and it's causing a lot of distortion or just a very high signal level. So I'm going to keep bringing it turns off. So maybe something like that. See if that works any better. All right. So there we have a reasonable looking sound recording that I can listen to on top of my other sound recording. Let's go ahead and do some effects and EQ on here. So this is pretty quiet right now, so I'm going to throw on some effects. So typically, I'll go to my EQ, throw on a high-pass filter. I'll leave this sort of right here right now, but I'll come and tweak it in a second. I'm going to add a compressor. And now I'm going to set the ratio to about 4. This is a very percussive sound, so a little bit of a larger or higher ratio is going to be okay. This is actually still not too aggressive. And now I'm going to go back to my track. I'm going to select just a little bit of this, and I'm going to solo this track and sort of set some compression settings. So what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for a little bit of gain reduction. So I'm going to bring the threshold down. Oops, I forgot to set clip our loop function on. So I can see there's already some compression being reduced because of where I'm setting the threshold. Now that means I can increase the output gain. And actually the best way to do this is select auto makeup. So it's going to automatically make up the gain from reducing the, bringing the threshold down and reducing the volume when it exceeds this threshold. Whoops, still a little bit too loud there, huh? You know what? Looks like I'm going to maybe want to increase this a little bit more because I really want that to pop. That's probably too close to threshold. So keep an eye on this. You don't want it to peak, and you probably want to give yourself a couple of dB of headroom over here as you're tweaking the compression settings. So now I'm going to add, again, some EQ, and I'm going to listen to this. I'm going to turn the metronome off just so I can listen to the clap sound by itself. I'll A-B. So I'm kind of listening for 3 different things. The first thing I'm listening for is some kind of like a low frequency kind of thud right when the sort of attack of the clap happens. So I'm kind of listening for that right here. Over here, I'm listening for where sort of like the main energy for the clap is, like where that kind of noisiness of the clap sticks out. And the last thing I'm doing is I'm thinking about maybe EQing the high frequencies a little bit. This is really a sort of a very typical, very non-ideal recording situation. I'm using my laptop internal microphone for recording this, so it sounds really terrible. So it needs a lot of help. In this kind of a situation, I might be a little bit more aggressive with how much EQ I'm applying, but this is actually quite a bit right now. So this is a 4 dB boost for the high shelf. This is a 4 dB boost for this mid bandpass filter, and a little bit more subtle on the low pass. You know, I think I'm going to be even more aggressive with this. Hopefully, if you have a good mic and a good recording situation, you don't have to be this aggressive. It's not really a good idea. All right, so that sounds at least a little bit cleaner and clearer, and that might help it to cut through the background of the other track. Let's go ahead and clear our loop. Actually, I'm going to set my loop to be just that much. All right, so I got some EQ and compression applied here. I can maybe do the same thing here. I have already actually gone through and applied some EQ and compression to this sound back when I was sort of tweaking when I created it. I went ahead and did that. So for right now, I'm going to call this good enough. Notice I still have a little bit of clipping going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and go back in here, go to the compressor, and bring down the output of my compressor another couple of dB. Another approach there is you could limit the output, but I try to avoid doing that kind of thing because you don't necessarily know what kind of algorithm they're using. It's better just to manually control the output yourself. So now that I have an audio track recorded and my basic track, background track set, what I might want to do is to add a MIDI track, like a virtual musical instrument track to this. So this is a track that you haven't recorded yourself, but is generated internally by Reaper. So we're not going to talk a lot about this at this stage in the class. We're going to talk about MIDI a lot within Maximus P. But I'll show you how to do this for this assignment, and you can use this as one of the tools. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a virtual instrument on a new track. So this is going to make a new track, and on that track, I'm going to put an instrument. So just like with the plugins like EQ and compression, Reaper also comes with some virtual instruments. So I'm looking for the Kakko's manufacturer, Resynth. I'm going to open that, and I've got a new track that has in it a Resynth virtual instrument. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. I'll come back and think about these settings in a little bit. Notice if I wanted to, I could add EQ or something like that to the plugin chain for my Resynth, and very likely I would want to do that to add some effects to the Resynth, but I'm not going to do that for right now. Okay, so I have a new track now, and it has a virtual instrument on it, but in order to add notes to it, I need to insert a new MIDI item into that track. I'm going to drag that MIDI item to start on beat 2, or on bar 2, because that's where my song starts. Now I'm going to double click it, and I'm going to get to a MIDI editor. So a MIDI editor, you can see, has a piano keyboard on the left side and a bunch of lines and grids on this side, which is representing bars and beats. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in a bass line to accompany my track. So I'm going to go down here to C2. I'm going to create a note. I'm going to make it a little bit long. Now I'm going to go into beat 4. I'm going to make another note on the and of 4. And then I'm going to make another note on the downbeat of beat 3. Whoops, I totally messed up. I put these in the wrong places, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to go here, I'm going to drag this to the downbeat of beat 3, and this, I decided I'm going to actually make it be a G. So I'm going to drag it down here, and notice that this G is highlighted when I click on it, so I can sort of see what note this is visually. So now I have a very simple track. I'm going to make this be a little bit longer, and I'm going to make this be a little bit shorter. And let's listen to what this sounds like. Let's go back to the beginning of the track. All right, so I think that sounds pretty good. But one thing I'm not happy about is how the sound of the bass just starts and stops when these MIDI notes start and stop. Especially this one kind of sounds a little bit awkward, right? So I could just resize where this note ends, but instead I'm going to go to my track, and I'm going to go to the settings of my virtual instrument. I'm going to manipulate the envelope. So what I want here is I want the note to ring out a little bit longer once it's stopped. And I'm also going to make it so that there's a little bit of a decay right at the beginning of the note, so it sounds like it was like a plucked bass or something like that. So now, a little bit of a release on it. Doesn't sound quite so sudden when it stops. I'm going to make a little bit of a longer release. So now it kind of fades out rather than just stopping really suddenly right there. I could do a lot of other things. I could mix in different kinds of sound waveforms to my synthesizer to change the sound of it. But I'm not going to do that for right now. I'm just going to leave it with the default for right now. All right. So now I've got a MIDI file on here, but I've noticed I'm having a problem. I'm clipping right here. So what do I need to do to get rid of that? Just play it again, hear it clipping. All right, so there's a clip right there. So the reason why is that my all of my faders right now are set at 0, right? So if in a digital system, if you go above 0, you're going to get clipping, you get that distortion happening, and we don't want that to happen. So I need to give myself a little bit more headroom and bring all of these faders down a little bit and make it so that I don't have that problem. I'm going to leave the master where it is because this is the master volume. But I'm going to set these 3 instrument tracks down a little bit. So there's a couple ways of doing it. You can just move the fader, of course. You can always monitor sort of where it is. It shows you in a couple different places. But you can also right-click that and type in where you want it to be. I'm going to set it down to be -6, which is going to be half as loud or half as much amplitude for all of these tracks. So that's not going to change the mix for these two. They're all the same relatively because they're all about half as loud as they were before. Got a lot more headroom over here right now, which is good, so I'm not having so much distortion and worries about that. All right, so since a MIDI track is very similar to an audio track, one of the things that Reaper does is it lets you loop very easily. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my overall arrangement here. So now I have my MIDI track recorded, and I want to try to loop it because I want to repeat it over the course of the track. So I'm going to drag this, and just like any audio loop, it'll loop. Any audio file will loop. And the loop point is indicated sort of by this little divot. The problem here is that this MIDI track, for some reason, is being set for 10 beats. So probably when I created it, I resized it to be this length, and then I didn't, I added the notes, and now it sort of thinks it's the wrong length. So I want this to repeat starting beat 2, and then I want it to repeat on bar 4, so bar 2 and bar 4. Right now it's repeating on bar 4, beat 3, and that's not what I want to have happen. So what I need to do is go in here, and I can change the length of the repeat by dragging this bar. So right now, if I go back out of here, and get rid of all these loops, all right, so that's what I want to have be the actual length of this loop. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to, whoops, now I can't see it, right? So I've got to drag this, so now I can see where that repeat, that little black line is. This is the end of the loop, so now I repeat it, it's going to repeat, consider the length of this loop to be up to this black bar, and after the black bar, we're going to get back to the beginning of the loop. So now when I drag this, everything should be synced up to beat to the correct beats. But it's off. Oh no. Why is it off? So it actually is snapping, it's just snapping on a bit of a different time grid than I'm used to. So just move that, and now we can see that everything is lined up very nicely. So now that I've got my MIDI track recorded and looped correctly, I want to try to loop some of these audio tracks as well to complete my track. So it's a very basic example. So let's say, for example, I wanted to loop this clapping part. You might think I could just grab this and extend it, right? But the problem is that it's looping this entire audio file. You can see that it's including this initial clap, which I don't want to include. I only want to include these 4 for that are contained within those 2 bars. And you can also see that it's also including all the blank space that's at the beginning and end of these tracks. This really isn't what I want. To do that, I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to sort of size it so it ends right on the beginning of beat 4, which is where I want the loop to start. The next thing I want to do is I want to trim the track. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to bar 2. So right at the beginning of that bar, select it. I'm going to split that track, so just these 2 bars selected. Now I'm going to double click this. Actually, I'm not going to double click it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Item, and I'm going to select Item Settings. Right now, what happens if I try to drag this, it's going to loop the whole audio track. I don't want that. I just want to drag to loop the selected item. So go to Track, go to Item, go to Item Settings, and I'm going to, instead of looping the item source, I'm going to loop section of item source. So now I'm just going to loop that section, those 2 bars of the item source. So blah, blah, just like that. So now you'll see that each of this repetition is just a repetition of the selected item. It doesn't include this sort of first clap and this whole opening section of audio. I might want to do the same thing here. So I'm going to take these two guys, I'm going to drag them to a new track, and I'm going to bring this down so it ends in the right place. I'm going to bring this forward so it ends in the right place. But the problem here is I don't want to cut off the very beginning of this note, right? Because that's actually an important part of the sound. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to split that item. And so now I have just this track right here. Well, something else I might do, because this sound doesn't start exactly in the beginning of it, maybe what I want to do here is instead of having the loop point start at the very right at the beginning of the downbeat, maybe I actually want this bar to loop from a little bit before that. So there's a couple ways of doing this, but maybe the best way to do it is to take a look at our snap settings. So I'm going to control click on snap, and right now we're snapping to quarter notes. Let's go and snap to 32nd notes, or 16th notes. All right, so now if I drag this audio file, it's going to drag to 32nd to 16th notes rather than to quarter notes. So I've got a 16th note pickup before the loop starts. And now I'm going to go to the end here, and I'm going to resize this to be 1/16th note shorter. So now this is still the same length, but rather than starting on the downbeat and ending on the downbeat, it starts on the 16th note before the downbeat, and it ends on the 16th note after the downbeat. I'm going to select that, go up to Item, Item Settings, Loop Section of Item Source, and now when I loop this, it's going to loop it, and we'll notice that the loop starts actually before the downbeat, not right on the downbeat. And again, that's preserving the sort of initial part of the sound that happens right before the downbeat. So if I go back to the beginning of our track, a great work of art it is not, but at least it's giving you some ideas for how to work with some MIDI tracks, how to loop audio and keep it in time, and how to find the tempo from an audio track that you import into